on the planet suddenly stopped believing that money existed, it would immediately revert back to mere paper. But if everyone stopped believing in the existence of water, that's not going to stop us from getting wet when it rains. The same idea holds for any of society's major fictions. Companies, nations, laws, human rights, you name it. If everyone stops believing in these things, the spell is broken. We also create narratives on a much smaller scale. What's the story of your life? Our narrative identities are extremely important, and fostering them can help us have a meaningful existence. And sometimes, this means telling a story of one's life that's not entirely based on reality. This isn't just true for people with psychological disorders, but everyone does this to some extent. I have a question for you. What do you think psychotherapists do? Do they always try to get people to see things exactly as they are? Of course not. Don't they often help people create narratives that downplay negatives and accentuate the positives in life? Doesn't therapy, on some level, replace old stories with new ones? Healthy stories, but stories still. Now, it's not hard to see the downside of this storytelling. For some people, telling positive stories is so much harder than telling negative ones, and this can cause much psychological pain. And on the larger scale, fictions at the global level have done incredible damage over the course of history. Consider the destructive power of the grotesque narratives driving the Holy Crusades, or Nazi Germany, or American slavery. Humans are natural storytellers, and we must accept that, big or small, these tales can take us to some good places, but they can also take us to some pretty scary ones too. A fourth potent function of language is its ability to carve up the world into categories. Shakespeare's Juliet famously proclaimed that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. But would it? Don't names for things often change the experience of those things? Have you ever wondered why wine tasters do blind tastings? Or have you ever stared at something not knowing what you're looking at, only to have a single word clear it up? Or have you ever considered why someone would so fiercely resist being called by a particular gender pronoun? In one of my favorite experiments in psychology, an MIT research team led by Leonard Lee went to real bars in Boston and had subjects do taste tests of two beers, Sam Adams and what they called MIT Brew, which was just Sam Adams plus several drops of balsamic vinegar. When knowing nothing about the secret ingredient, subjects chose the MIT Brew 60% of the time. However, when they were told of the secret ingredient right before they took a sip, that number plummeted to about 20%. So even though people drank the exact same thing in both conditions, naming vinegar as an ingredient left a bad taste in people's mouths. The ability to categorize is certainly not unique to humans, but language greatly enhances categorization because it explicitly marks a category. That's what words do. They signal what they are and also what they're not. When I say dog, you conjure up features like fur, tails, and barking, and simultaneously you inhibit features like feathers, wings, and chirping. Another powerful function of words is to create new categories where none existed. Have you ever heard of the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows? It's a website and YouTube channel created by the artist John Koenig. His mission, and I quote, is to fill holes in the language, to give a name to emotions that we all feel but don't have a word for. His dictionary is made up of new words that capture unusual but oddly familiar categories of experience that, at least in English, have no name. My favorite of his words is sonder, which means the realization that each random passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own. You may have never felt that, but now that you have a name for it, I bet you will. What's interesting about this is that some of these invented words have actually caught on with people. One of my students told me of a cafe in her hometown in Colorado that is called Sonder Coffee and Tea. After she took my class and graduated, she wrote to say that it has Koenig's definition painted on the wall. I guess if you build it, they will come. Now, even though categorical thinking is extremely useful, it is a double-edged sword. Linguistic categories can exacerbate differences. They can promote harmful stereotypes, and they can deceive us into thinking the world is simpler than it really is. As with other products of language, we must be clear-eyed in taking the good with the bad. Okay, our final major function of language is metaphor. If you look closely, you may be surprised to see how much we use metaphor in everyday life. Now, I've blatantly deployed a variety of analogies in this course, which are cousins to metaphors. I presented language as bacteria, disease, and cure, as a tool, a game, an organism, a digestive system, and an arrowhead. Not to mention analogies for language in the brain, a house, a boxer, and even a tennis racket. That's a new one for me. But beyond these explicit comparisons, I've also used hundreds of sneaky little conceptual metaphors. For example, here's a handful from just this lecture alone. Cap off this course. Building blocks for thought. Categorical thinking is a double-edged sword. Logic is a cornerstone. And a mind sent reeling. Even this question is a metaphor in disguise. How far should we go with this idea? Technically, we have ideas, but we don't literally go places with them, do we? In 1980, metaphors like these were spotlighted in George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's splashy book, Metaphors We Live By. The book did two big things. It described the ubiquity of conceptual metaphors in everyday language, and by showing their prevalence, Lakoff and Johnson made the case that metaphors are much more than just artistic flourishes. They're actually a fundamental part of human thought. So what does metaphor do for our thinking? For one, it makes the abstract concrete, and this breathes life into language. When Wittgenstein says, philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language, it captures the imagination much better than saying, philosophers must recognize that language can confuse us and they need to work hard to ensure that never happens. Where's the pizzazz in that? Another function of metaphor is to extract specific elements of something. If categories are good at drawing boundaries between different things, metaphors excel at highlighting the similarities. By using the familiar word battle, Wittgenstein accentuates that philosophy is a process that can be violent, protracted, heroic, winnable, and painful, just to name a few elements. These connections help us to structure thought in targeted ways. And the fact that we often forget that we're even thinking with metaphor tells you just how deep that structure goes. And thirdly, metaphor is a fount of creativity. It bubbles up in every possible place. Music, law, art, poetry, film, literature, science, politics, absolutely everywhere. Mapping one thing onto something similar yet different is a vehicle for seeing the world in a fresh way. But therein lies its biggest downside. Metaphor is never a perfect vehicle. Something's always added, something's always lost. By emphasizing a particular connection, you necessarily distort the thing you're trying to connect to. To take a line often misattributed to Freud, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. This is a big problem for anyone using metaphor to try to capture the truth about the world. It's ironic, and perhaps intentionally so, that Wittgenstein used metaphor in his quote about what philosophy is. And just to go meta, have I misled you with all the figurative language I've used to talk about language in the mind? Or maybe, just maybe, this is getting it all wrong. Maybe there's no meaning, at least from the perspective of the human mind, outside of metaphor and language. Maybe metaphor is just the quintessential manifestation of minds that have capital L language, minds that understand one thing by mapping it on to another. Maybe this means we'll never have direct access to the truth. Maybe Wittgenstein was right when he said, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." Okay, Maybe you're not willing to go that far, and I'm not so sure I am either. But I hope you're at least convinced that language has radically transformed the human mind. This transformation has given us tools to experience, know, and do things that are impossible for any other species on the planet, and for all we know, maybe even beyond. But let's not forget, and I'll finish up here, let's not forget that a mind filled with language isn't everything. I leave you with a modern-day interpretation of a passage from Rumi, the Islamic philosopher-poet from 13th century Persia. Silence is an ocean. Speech is a river. When the ocean is searching for you,